They say that when a locker door swings open on a cold morning, the air inside tastes different than the air outside. It's stale, heavy, and smells of old corrugated cardboard, damp concrete, and forgotten lives. For 12 years, Unit 114 at Oak Ridge Self-Storage had held the quiet weight of 36 years of my career and 40 years of my marriage. It was a climate-controlled 20 by 30-foot vault encased in reinforced cinder block, secured with an industrial-grade disc lock, and tucked away at the quiet end of a graveled access drive on the outskirts of town. Inside sat the wooden filing cabinets, the steel safes, and the water-sealed lockboxes containing every paper trail I had ever built. Deeds, corporate ledgers, original land trust agreements, tax audits, and the private family trust that protected my 90-acre timber homestead on Mill Creek Road. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 64 years old. I spent nearly 4 decades working as a senior forensic auditor and fraud investigator for the State Department of Revenue. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that people don't destroy evidence or liquidate assets in broad daylight with brass bands playing. They move quietly in the early hours before the banks open, using forged forms, unauthorized keys, and half-truths whispered into the ears of unsuspecting clerks. You learn that silence is the most dangerous sound in a financial investigation, and that when someone tries to strip your foundation away, they always target your records first. It was a sharp, frost-covered Tuesday morning in early November when my cell phone vibrated across the wooden kitchen table next to my coffee mug. The caller ID showed Oak Ridge Self-Storage. I picked up the phone, setting down my reading glasses. Arthur Vance speaking. Arthur? It's Ray Miller down at Oak Ridge. The voice came through, strained, rushed, and filled with a thick, uncomfortable tightness. Ray had managed the facility for 15 years. He was a retired county sheriff's deputy who knew every renter by name, knew every vehicle that passed through the electronic gate, and took pride in running a tight, secure facility. "Morning, Ray," I said, keeping my tone relaxed. "Everything all right down at the lot?" There was a long pause on the line. The kind of heavy, pregnant silence that instantly sets off every alarm bell honed over 36 years of state service. "Arthur, I'm standing inside Unit 114 right now," Ray said softly, his voice echoing slightly against bare concrete walls. "The double doors are wide open. The steel shelving units are stripped bare. The filing cabinets are gone. The floor is swept clean. Your daughter, Clara, and her husband Greg pulled up in a commercial box truck at 6:15 a.m. with 2 hired laborers. They punched in using your master gate code, presented a notarized durable power of attorney document, and loaded every single crate, safe, and cabinet into the back of that truck. A cold, razor-sharp stillness settled over my chest. The quiet in my kitchen grew sudden and immense. "A durable power of attorney, Ray?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave into a calm, mechanical register. "She gave me a stamped copy, Arthur," Ray said, his breath hitching over the line. "It had your notarized signature, a state seal dated 3 weeks ago, and a medical certification claiming you were legally incapacitated due to cognitive decline. She told me you were being transitioned into an assisted memory care facility downtown this afternoon, and that she was authorized to consolidate your personal property into a corporate escrow account." I stood up from the oak table, looking out the window at the frost glistening on the grass of the lower pasture. "Ray, did you look at the notary stamp on that paper?" "It's signed by a notary named Marcus Vance, Arthur," Ray replied. It looked completely official. I didn't have any reason to doubt her until I saw them loading the heavy steel fireproof safes into the truck. When I asked where the keys were, Greg sneered at me and said they had a locksmith waiting at their corporate office to drill the tumblers. That's when my gut turned over, Arthur. Something felt wrong. So I waited until they drove off, pulled your master file, and called your personal cell. "Ray," I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as granite, "I need you to lock down the gate access logs immediately. Do not clear the security camera video from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. Save the footage to an external flash drive, print out the entry badge timestamps, and keep that copy of the power of attorney on your desk. I am on my way down, and I am bringing a federal postal inspector and a state financial crimes investigator with me." The line went quiet for a moment before Ray breathed out a heavy sigh. I knew it. God help them, Arthur. The gate video caught every angle of their truck, their license plate, and Clara signing the visitor log. I hung up the phone and stood alone in the hallway. My daughter, Clara, 34 years old, a vice president of marketing for a commercial real estate firm, a woman whose college education, wedding, and first mortgage down payment I had funded, had just used a forged power of attorney to clear out 36 years of my forensic files, property title deeds, and land trust records. She and her husband, Greg, a man who ran a failing private equity outfit downtown and was drowning in high-interest debt, thought they had struck a decisive blow. They thought that by seizing my physical records, drilling my safes, and presenting a fraudulent incapacity document, they could seize control of my $3.5 million timberland and extinguish the family trust before I even realized what had happened. They didn't know that 3 days ago, I had noticed an irregularity in my bank notifications. They didn't know that my brother-in-law, Marcus Vance, the very man whose name they had forged on the notary stamp, was a retired chief of financial crimes for the state police who had spent the last 72 hours auditing every filing submitted in my name across 3 counties. And most importantly, they didn't know that Unit 114 was never where I kept the originals. I walked into my study, unlocked the cedar cabinet behind my desk, and picked up my phone. I dialed my brother-in-law's direct line. "Marcus," I said as soon as he picked up. "They took the bait. Clara and Greg just emptied Unit 114 using the forged power of attorney and the fake incapacity filing. They're heading toward Greg's office downtown with 3 steel safes full of decoy ledger files." On the other end of the line, Marcus let out a slow, grim laugh. "They picked up the decoy safes? Excellent. Postal Inspector Jenkins and Special Agent Sarah Miller are sitting in my driveway right now. We have the wiretap authorization, the emergency seizure warrants for Greg's commercial premises, and the video feed from the storage facility. I'm meeting you at the storage locker to collect the gate logs," I said, pulling my heavy canvas jacket off the brass hook by the door. "Then we're going downtown. It's time to show my daughter and her husband what happens when you try to audit an auditor." By 9:15 that morning, the sky above the industrial corridor east of downtown had turned the color of bruised slate. A fine, needle-like sleet was beginning to tick against the windshield of Marcus's unmarked Crown Victoria as we idled in the gravel apron across from Greg's warehouse. The building was a corrugated steel structure with faded green trim, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Out front sat Greg's dark blue BMW alongside a silver commercial box truck. Through the high, dirt-smudged transom windows, the yellow glow of halogen work lights cut through the morning gloom. "They're inside," Marcus said, keeping his eyes fixed on his dash-mounted monitor. The screen displayed 3 separate camera feeds streamed directly from the covert microlens cameras I had concealed inside the brass lock housings of the 3 steel safes 4 months ago. Greg, your daughter Clara, and a local commercial locksmith named Wayne. I adjusted my collar and looked at the primary feed. On screen, Greg was pacing back and forth across a concrete floor littered with wooden pallets and industrial strapping. He was gesturing wildly, his face flushed red, while Clara stood near a heavy steel workbench, leafing through a stack of plastic sleeve protectors containing my tax ledgers. In the center of the workbench sat the first of my 3 heavy fireproof safes, a 400-pound sentry safe lined with 1/4-inch manganese plate. "Look at his hands," Marcus murmured, zooming in on Greg's trembling fingers. "He's desperate, Arthur." The state tax board served his private equity firm with a freeze and seize audit notice at 5 p.m. yesterday. He thinks those safes contain the original unredacted land trust deeds for the Mill Creek timberland. He thinks if he burns the originals, the land defaults back to the shell company he registered in Delaware under Clara's maiden name. "And Clara?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What is she doing?" "She's reading the decoy beneficiary ledger," Marcus replied, pointing a finger at the screen. "The one you handwrote in March." On the monitor, Clara suddenly stopped turning pages. Her body went rigid. The folder in her hand sagged toward the steel tabletop. She turned her head slowly toward Greg, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. "She found it," I said quietly. "She found it," Marcus agreed. She just realized that 6 months ago, long before they ever drafted that forged power of attorney, You transferred the entire 90-acre estate, the timber rights, and all liquid assets into an irrevocable charitable foundation managed directly by the State Attorney General's office. Right on screen, the door to the office area swung open. A man wearing an orange high-visibility vest stepped into frame, Special Agent Sarah Miller from the State Financial Crimes Unit, flanked by Postal Inspector Jenkins and 2 uniformed officers. "All right, Arthur," Marcus said, turning off the ignition key. "That's our signal. Time to go collect the notary logbook." The rain had settled into a steady, cold drizzle by the time we reached the glass and steel building of North American Mutual Insurance on Elm Street. The 3rd floor was quiet, smelling of ozone, fresh carpet adhesive, and stale coffee. Sitting behind a broad mahogany desk was Walter Vance, no relation to me or Marcus, but a senior claims adjuster with 30 years of insurance law under his belt. He was a small, sharp-eyed man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, wearing a gray tweed vest. "Arthur," Walter said, standing up to shake my hand. "It's been a long time. Marcus told me on the phone that you've got an emergency audit request regarding policy 884 Delta. "That's right, Walter," I said, taking a seat across from him while Marcus remained standing by the door, his hands resting casually on the brass head of his walking stick. "I need you to pull up the master beneficiary file and the rider changes for my $2 million life insurance and property trust policy." Walter nodded, sliding his spectacles down his nose as his fingers clacked across his keyboard. "Policy 884 Delta. Arthur Vance. Beneficiary established in 1998 as the Arthur and Sarah Vance Revocable Family Trust, with Clara Vance named as contingent heir upon reaching age 30. Standard setup. Check the filing history from this year," I said quietly. "Specifically the first week of March." Walter's fingers paused over the keys. He looked up at me over his glasses, then back at the dual monitors in front of him. He clicked through a couple of drop-down menus, clicked once more, and then froze. The room went completely dead quiet. The sound of the rain against the window pane seemed to grow louder. Walter's shoulders went rigid. He didn't type another word. He just stared at the right-hand monitor, his brow furrowing into deep, heavy lines. He reached out, grabbed a printed hard copy folder from the locked filing drawer beside his desk, opened it, and began flipping through thin blue carbon sheets. The insurance adjuster went quiet reading my policy. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly with a microfiber cloth, put them back on, and stared at the screen again. "Arthur," Walter said, his voice dropping into a hushed, strained whisper. "Who changed your beneficiary in March?" "You tell me, Walter," I said, leaning forward. "On March 14th, Walter said, reading directly off the secure log, a signed, notarized change of beneficiary endorsement was submitted digitally through our regional portal. It removed the family trust entirely. It removed your daughter, Clara. It designated a primary sole beneficiary, Apex Equity Partners LLC, managed by Gregory Vance." Marcus stepped forward from the door, his leather soles snapping against the floorboards. "Look at the notary signature on that March 14th digital filing, Walter." Walter clicked the attachment icon, opening the scanned PDF of the endorsement form. He zoomed in on the bottom right corner where the round rubber seal sat. "Notary Public, Marcus Vance," Walter read aloud. Then he stopped, his eyes darting up to Marcus. "Marcus, this has your state commission number." "Except on March 14th, Marcus said, pulling a leather binder from his coat and laying it flat on Walter's desk. "I was in Miami testifying as an expert witness in a federal tax fraud trial. Here are my flight records, my hotel receipts, and the federal court transcript signed by Judge Robert Lawson. I wasn't within 1,200 miles of a notary stamp on March 14th. Walter sat back in his leather chair, the color slowly draining from his face. "This isn't just an unauthorized change. They used a forged state seal to divert a $2 million death benefit and the underlying property casualty rider to a private corporate entity. And that's why they were drilling my safe this morning, Walter," I said, my voice level and hard. "Greg didn't just want the timberland. He had taken out a high-risk commercial loan against Apex Equity Partners using that fraudulent insurance policy assignment as collateral. He needed to destroy my original policy documents and my private ledger before the annual audit caught the discrepancy. Walter reached for his desk phone, his hand steady but his expression deadly serious. I am placing an immediate fraud freeze on policy 884 Delta, notifying our corporate legal counsel, and flagging Apex Equity Partners with the state insurance commissioner. Don't freeze it just yet, Walter, Marcus interrupted, holding up a hand. Let the system show, pending review, for another 2 hours. Special Agent Miller and Postal Inspector Jenkins are sitting in Greg's warehouse right now with Greg and Clara. They're about to present the March 14th filing to Greg and ask him to explain where he got Marcus's notary seal. Walter looked at the screen, then at me, and finally at Marcus. A slow, grim smile touched the corner of the old adjuster's mouth. Arthur, Walter said, leaning back. In 30 years, I've seen people try every trick in the book to scam an insurance policy. But trying to forge the seal of a retired chief of financial crimes, that takes a special kind of stupid. It's not just stupid, Walter, I said, standing up and buttoning my canvas coat. It's a felony. And it's time to finish the audit. The interrogation room at the county judicial complex was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. A single fluorescent fixture hummed overhead, casting a harsh, pale light across the polished composite table. Sitting across from Special Agent Sarah Miller and Postal Inspector Jenkins was Greg Vance. His tie was loosened at the collar, his hair disheveled, and his expensive tailored jacket thrown over the back of an empty metal chair. Gone was the smug, triumphant sneer he had worn outside the warehouse 4 hours earlier. Beside him sat his corporate defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Vance Sterling, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as Agent Miller laid out a series of color-printed exhibits on the table. Clara sat in an adjoining room behind a one-way mirror, flanked by an assistant public defender, her face completely pale as she watched her husband on the video monitor. Marcus and I stood in the observation gallery next to the lead prosecutor, watching through the dark glass. Let's go over the timeline again, Mr. Vance, Agent Miller said, tapping a pen against the topmost document, a certified copy of the March 14th Beneficiary Modification Form. On March 14th of this year, a digital filing was uploaded to the North American Mutual Insurance Portal. It replaced the Arthur and Sarah Vance Revocable Family Trust with Apex Equity Partners LLC as the primary beneficiary of a $2 million life insurance and property casualty policy. Greg leaned back, folding his arms tightly across his chest. I've already told you, Agent. My father-in-law, Arthur, signed that document voluntarily during a corporate restructuring meeting at our office. He wanted to help stabilize Apex Equity's commercial credit line. Is that so? Inspector Jenkins interjected, leaning forward and sliding a second document across the table. Then perhaps you can explain why the notary seal on this March 14th filing bears the commission number and signature of Marcus Vance. Greg's eyes flicked down to the paper, then quickly back to Jenkins. Marcus was present at the meeting. He notarized the signature. That's a federal crime to lie to a postal inspector, Mr. Vance, Jenkins said flatly. Marcus Vance was in Miami, Florida, on March 14th. We have his TSA gate logs, his hotel keycard records, his rental car telemetry, and 200 pages of sworn court testimony from the United States District Court in Miami where he was acting as an expert witness for the Department of Justice. Greg swallowed hard. His throat made a dry, audible clicking sound. He looked at his attorney, but Sterling remained dead silent, staring down at the hotel receipts Jenkins had provided. Furthermore, Agent Miller continued, opening a second blue folder, we obtained the digital metadata from the PDF upload. The document was generated on an IP address registered to your personal laptop at 11:42 p.m. on March 13th. The notary seal image was digitally ripped from a public land deed Marcus signed 6 years ago in Oak Ridge County, resized in a graphic editing program, and pasted onto the authorization form. Greg's chest began to heave slightly. Look, this is a family financial misunderstanding. Arthur is 64 years old. He's experiencing memory lapses. Clara and I were simply acting in his best long-term interest to preserve the estate from tax liabilities. Save it, Greg. Agent Miller cut him off cleanly. We executed a search warrant on Apex Equities bank accounts 45 minutes ago. On March 18th, 4 days after this forged beneficiary form was submitted, you used that $2 million policy rider as collateral to secure a $750,000 high-interest commercial bridge loan from a private lender in Delaware. You then transferred $500,000 of those funds directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to cover your firm's margin calls. Greg froze. The blood drained out of his face so fast he looked almost gray under the fluorescent lights. That constitutes federal mail fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and loan fraud, Inspector Jenkins added calmly. And because you used a forged durable power of attorney to break into Unit 114 at Oak Ridge Self-Storage this morning and seize Arthur Vance's private records, you are also facing state charges for commercial burglary and grand larceny. In the observation room, I watched Greg's hands begin to tremble violently. He turned to his lawyer, his voice rising into a panicked squeak. Sterling, say something. Tell them this is a civil matter between family members. Attorney Sterling slowly closed his leather notepad, capped his pen, and turned to Greg. Greg, shut your mouth right now. Do not say another word. I am withdrawing as your corporate counsel. You need a criminal defense attorney immediately. Through the one-way glass, I saw Clara slump forward in her chair in the adjacent room, burying her face in her hands as the full reality of their scheme collapsed around them. They're done, Arthur, Marcus said softly beside me, putting a hand on my shoulder. The grand jury meets on Thursday. By Friday morning, Greg will be in federal custody without bail, and Clara will be facing formal indictment as a co-conspirator. I took a deep, quiet breath, looking at my daughter through the dark glass. She had 36 years of honesty laid out in front of her, Marcus. She chose 6 months of Greg's lies instead. People who chase fast money always forget that paper leaves a trail, Arthur, Marcus said. Come on. Let's go home. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the rain had turned into a steady, freezing sleet that rattled against the double-paned glass of Greg's corporate corner office on the 6th floor of the Elm Street Executive Building. The room was furnished with heavy mahogany, plush leather chairs, and framed architectural renderings of commercial high-rises, developments that, according to the state financial audit, existed only as paper shell entities designed to absorb high-interest bridge loans. Sitting at the main conference table were Greg and Clara. Across from them sat Special Agent Sarah Miller, Postal Inspector Jenkins, and Marcus Vance. I sat slightly back near the corner window, keeping my canvas jacket on, watching my daughter's face. In the center of the polished mahogany table sat a small, black Sony digital voice recorder. Let the record reflect, Special Agent Miller began, her voice crisp and measured as the red recording light pulsed softly, that this is a formal voluntary interview with Gregory Vance and Clara Vance, conducted in the presence of legal counsel, Vance Sterling. Greg leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, trying to maintain his composed, corporate posture. Agent Miller, as my attorney has already stated, we are fully prepared to cooperate to resolve what is clearly an administrative mix-up regarding the beneficiary assignment on Arthur's policy. An administrative mix-up? Marcus asked, his voice low and smooth as he leaned forward from his chair. Greg, when you submit a digitally altered state notary seal bearing my commission number, uploaded from your personal IP address at 11:42 p.m. on March 13th, that isn't an administrative mix-up. That is a Class C felony under State Financial Code 804. Clara turned her head toward Greg, her eyes wide, her knuckles white as she gripped her leather portfolio. Greg, you said Marcus signed that in person at your lawyer's office. Greg's jaw tightened. Clara, quiet. No, Greg, Inspector Jenkins interjected, sliding a thick manila folder across the wood. Don't tell her to be quiet. Because Clara's name is on the secondary transfer authorization dated March 18th, the document that attempted to assign Arthur's $3.5 million timberland trust as collateral to Apex Equity Partners. Jenkins reached over and pressed the play button on the small black recorder. A sharp hiss of static filled the room, followed by the clear, unmistakably distinct audio of a phone call recorded 6 weeks prior. A call intercepted under a federal wiretap authorization placed on Greg's business line. She doesn't know about the March beneficiary swap yet. Greg's voice came through the speaker, loud, dry, and arrogant. Arthur thinks the timber trust is still held in his revocable family fund. Once we execute the power of attorney and clear out his storage locker, he won't have the original deed logs to prove the baseline value. Clara thinks we're doing this to shelter him from capital gains tax. Keep her focused on the memory care placement paperwork. A second voice, Greg's managing partner in Delaware, came through the speaker. What happens when the old man checks with his adjuster at North American Mutual? Greg's recorded laugh was cold and brief. He won't. The old man is 64 and sits out on his porch all day. He trusts Clara. By the time he realizes the policy moved to Apex, the land will be liquidated and the offshore transfer will be complete. Jenkins paused the recording. The silence in the room was so sudden and absolute that you could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent ceiling lights and the sleet ticking against the window pane. Clara sat entirely frozen. She didn't look at Greg. She didn't look at the officers. She slowly turned her head and looked across the room at me, sitting in the shadow by the window. Dad. Her voice was a thin, trembling whisper that cracked on the vowel. I didn't know. He told me the trust was being audited by the state. He told me you were losing your memory. I stood up slowly from my chair, the heavy soles of my work boots quiet against the carpet, and walked over to the edge of the table. You didn't ask me, Clara, I said softly, looking down into my daughter's tear-filled eyes. In 34 years, you never once picked up the phone to ask your father if he was okay. You took his word, you took his forged notary stamp, and you walked into Unit 114 with a crowbar and a box truck. Arthur, Attorney Vance Sterling said, raising a hand. My client is prepared to execute a full, immediate rescission of all filings, return all seized documents, and relinquish any claim. It's too late for a rescission, Mr. Sterling, Special Agent Miller said flatly, standing up and opening her leather badge wallet. The grand jury returned a multi-count indictment 20 minutes ago. Gregory Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, mail fraud, aggravated identity theft, and scheme to defraud. 2 uniformed state troopers stepped into the office through the double glass doors, handcuffs clicking sharply in the quiet room. Greg stood up abruptly, his chair sliding backward into the credenza, his face flushed with panic. Clara, call Sterling's partner. Get the bail fund ready. Clara didn't move. She didn't reach for her phone. She sat motionless, her face buried in her hands, sobbing silently as the troopers pulled Greg's arms behind his back and snapped the steel cuffs around his wrists. Come on, Greg, one of the troopers said, turning him toward the door. Let's take a ride downtown. By 6 o'clock that evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the night sky clear, crisp, and filled with sharp winter stars. Marcus and I drove back out to Mill Creek Road in his truck, the headlights cutting through the dark timber stand that bordered the gravel driveway. The 90 acres of black walnut and red oak sat quiet, dark, and permanent against the hill. We pulled up to the house, stepped onto the porch, and walked inside. Ray Miller had finished installing the heavy-duty Schlage commercial double-cylinder deadbolts on both the front and rear entry doors. On the kitchen table sat 3 neat, ribbon-bound folders containing the certified original title deeds, the irrevocable land trust filings, and the verified beneficiary documentation from North American Mutual Insurance, all bearing the genuine, unassailable seal of the State Attorney General's office. Marcus took off his coat and hung it on the brass hook by the door, then walked over to the wood stove and stoked the fire until bright orange flames licked up around the seasoned oak logs. Well, Arthur, Marcus said, leaning against the hearth with a mug of black coffee. The audit is officially closed. I stood by the kitchen window, looking out into the dark yard where the frost was beginning to form on the lower pasture grass. It was never about the money for Greg, I said quietly, turning back toward the warmth of the fire. He thought because I was retired, because I lived out here in the quiet with my books and my timber, that I had stopped paying attention. People who operate in the dark always make the same mistake, Arthur, Marcus said, raising his mug slightly. They assume that because you're quiet, you can't see what they're doing in the light. I pulled out my new steel keyring, holding the heavy brass key Ray had cut for me earlier that afternoon. I walked to the front door, pushed the key into the cylinder, and turned it. The heavy steel deadbolt shot smoothly into the reinforced oak jamb, securing the house, securing the land, and closing the final chapter on 36 years of accounting. Unshaken, unbroken, and completely whole.